The FBI say there was a concerted effort to discredit the agency's own information about Hunter Biden in the months before the all-important 2020 election. There is a ton of gravity to this story. A letter from Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley to the Department of Justice indicates an FBI agent worked hard to discredit his own agency's intelligence on Hunter Biden. Information that paints a picture not just of a politician's corrupted, screwed up son, but information that painted the Biden family as a corrupted regime, with Hunter as a bagman, pulling in cash that was, of course, used by his father and the entire family. It is just another of the several examples that we have seen of how the deep state and the swamp worked overtime to make sure that Donald Trump was removed from office. Senator Rand Paul joins us here in just a few minutes to dive deep into all of that. In other news, Trump and Pence with dueling speeches in Washington today. Trump's speech hammering away at law and order in the United States, or lack thereof, pointing out the despicable lawlessness that we see today in this country and all the filth, especially in our major cities. Mike Pence revealing how he is going to make a run for the White House in 2024 by tying himself to Trump's successes but refusing to look back on the 2020 election. Here is part of both of those speeches.
A lot of people say they hate our country. It's the only reason they'd allow things like this to happen, because just from a common sense standpoint, how can you allow it to happen? And just look at the statistics, how bad it becomes.
I don't know that our movement is that divided. I don't know that the president and I differ on issues. But we may differ on focus.
Getting a very interesting look at what this is going to look like as this all builds up. We're going to know a lot more here in the next few months. I'd say it's pretty certain both of those two men are going to be running for president, though, the beginnings of the GOP fight for 2024. On the economy, consumer confidence numbers came out today, and as expected, they were not good at all. The number dropping for the third month in a row, lower than expectations. Tomorrow, the Fed meets again to raise interest rates again, perhaps by as much as another full point. Associated Press continues to expose itself as purely partisan on this and most stories, as most believe we're going to see a second quarter of negative GDP in this country, which has long been the definition of a recession. Here comes the AP to save the Biden White House with this headline. It says an explainer here, how they're going to tell you, right, how a recession has begun, what you need to know. Economists say 2 negative quarters wouldn't mean that a recession had started. The writer showing off the same hiring data that the White House has been sharing, saying wages are also rising at a healthy pace, with many employers still struggling to attract and retain enough workers. So again, what they're doing is using some very useful information to try and spin this on you. The economy was entirely turned off not even 2 years ago. There was nowhere to go but up from there. Obviously, there will be growth, and wages are rising because inflation is skyrocketing. The AP trying to use that to fool you into thinking that the economy is just peaches. Yeah, right. Biden evidently feeling better after COVID, his symptoms subsiding to the point that his doctors say he can resume his exercise, so he'll be doing those 350 pounds on the squat deck, I'm sure, by tomorrow. Biden releasing a fiery video on Twitter last night, an angry and very desperate president slamming Trump, pandering hard to police, which is bizarre after he and his party gutted law and order in this country back in 2020. Take a look.
You can't be pro-insurrection and pro-cop. You can't be pro-insurrection and pro-democracy. You can't be pro-insurrection and pro-American. There can be no greater responsibility than to do all we can to ensure the safety of our families, our children, our community, our nation, and our law enforcement officers.
Boy, yeah. If there's anybody fighting for your safety and the safety of our cops, it's that man right there. Angry and desperate, gaslighting America. A pitiful speech. Also today, the Biden White House selling off another 20 million barrels of American oil as the energy illiterate regime tries to fight off horrific poll numbers by bartering away our strategic reserves and, of course, risking our national security with it. Our strategic reserves once held 727 million barrels. Did you know that? It's a lot of oil. Rather than promote American energy independence, though, Biden is just selling off huge portions of that. Now we're down to about 480 million barrels, and they're not done selling it. You know they're going to keep doing this. This, as the Wall Street Journal reports, another incredible story about our greatest nemesis, and that is China. The Journal reporting the Chinese tried to build an entire network inside of our own Federal Reserve. Meanwhile, your government is obsessed with what? White supremacy? The Chinese looking for any way to steal this country's secrets and sabotage healthy American policy, and they have been doing a hell of a job at that. In other news, the New York Times, desperate to spin the border disaster as Trump's fault. New piece highlighting gruesome details on migrants being tortured and held hostage, beaten with hammers, a multi-billion-dollar business that has exploded under Joe Biden, that is the cartels and the smuggling. But the author, Miriam Jordan from the New York Times, couldn't help herself. An impressive stretch here when she blames Trump and Title 42 for what we're seeing at the border right now. Not the removal of Title 42, but actually blaming Title 42, saying, quote, "It has authorized the immediate expulsion of those caught crossing the border illegally, allowing migrants to cross repeatedly in the hope of eventually succeeding," which has led to a substantial escalation in the number of migrant encounters at the border, 1.7 million in fiscal 2021, and brisk business for smugglers. So the New York Times is not blaming the president who told migrants to surge the border. Not going to blame Biden for this, even though Biden said surge our border. They're going to blame the president who actually tried to secure it with a 30-foot tall wall, and saying the best way to stop migrant smuggling, according to the New York Times, is to just let everybody in so they don't try more than once. That's the New York Times on immigration, if you want to know how impressively stupid some of the people employed at that newspaper are. Also tonight, a British communist has found herself appropriately positioned within the World Health Organization, right where they belong. Susan Michi was recently appointed to the massive bureaucracy that is desperate to control your entire life. Here was Michi during the pandemic arguing that masks and other safety measures should continue forever.
We'll need to keep this going in the long term.
Then when you say long term, what do you mean by that? How long? Very quickly.
I think forever.
Oh, why don't you stay in your house for the rest of your life? Dirty little communist, itching for as much control over your life as she can possibly get, and all the benefits that that pandemic brought to globalists and, well, socialists and communists alike. And finally, over at CNN, a total lack of awareness as hosts and a reporter discuss the need to circumvent democracy in order to save the planet from climate change.
Part of their plea is, please get Joe Manchin to change his mind. You know, this is hung up on an old-fashioned filibuster, sort of recent made-up American rules where the fate of life on Earth is at stake.
Bill Weir. Jesus. The fate of planet Earth is at stake if we don't go around Joe Manchin, who's a moderate Democrat, by the way. Maybe, just maybe, people over at CNN might want to think about the fact that, you know, maybe this isn't as dire as they think. Maybe gutting our entire economy just so we can keep allowing India and China to really pollute the world is not the best move. You know, maybe they ought to open their mind a little bit and actually see what's going on here. But no, they're just going to keep pulling the same politics as always. Our reporters tonight, Sarah Williamson, on the government's continued assault on Tesla. Elon Musk's politics already earned him that snub from the White House. They didn't want to invite him to the electric car summit. Now the government has his company under investigation for racism. Oh, okay. And Alex Salvi is in Rome tonight as Russia is threatening to cut off energy to Europe and the big Trump I told you so. But let's get back to our big story of the night first. This explosive letter from Senator Chuck Grassley to Merrick Garland and Christopher Wray. Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky joins us now. And, sir, thank you for coming on tonight. Here's a line from this letter from Chuck Grassley. I'm going to read it to you. FBI Supervisory Intelligence Analyst Brian Auten opened an assessment which was used by an FBI headquarters team to improperly discredit negative Hunter Biden information as disinformation and caused investigative activity to cease. And this is such an explosive revelation, what Grassley is alleging here. The DOJ, even under Donald Trump, was actually working to protect Joe Biden in the lead up to the election. How big of a deal is this?
I think it's a huge deal, and the person should be immediately fired. We can't have members of the FBI cherry-picking information, targeting information, trying to disprove information. They're supposed to gather the information, not sift through it and sort it out according to their politics. So no, this is right up there with Lisa Page, Peter Strzok kind of activity, and it can't be tolerated. There needs to be a zero tolerance for it. He should be immediately fired, suspended, investigated, and then if it's true, fired.
And this, I mean, there's no question in my mind that this certainly would have influenced the election if they actually managed to keep an investigation away from Hunter Biden that would have opened up, the possibility, the very real possibility of corruption in what would be the first family. That changes votes. That changes people's minds.
Well, it's even worse than just this one person in government. There were 55 people outside of government who had been at high levels in government, including former heads of intelligence agencies, who all signed a document saying that this was promulgated by the Russians, that this was Russian disinformation. It turns out what they were promoting was disinformation, that every bit of this was true. And so, yes, I think that there need to be repercussions for these people. Instead, though, they continue to make hundreds of thousands of dollars, each of them, working for various networks who actually promoted the lie that the Russians had something to do with this Hunter Biden laptop.
It's something else. Earlier this week, Axios gave us insight into Trump's platform, if he does, in fact, run in 2024, which is effectively, they said, to get rid of these kinds of bureaucrats, which I think Trump alleges are all over our government, people that are working against democracy, people that are working to protect a very large, bloated, and in a lot of cases, corrupted government. What do you think of that idea?
Well, you know, there is a deep state. When people try to say there's not a deep state, they're not paying attention. The deep state is these intelligent officials who have political bias, who are around from administration to administration. They don't change. Yeah. They stay there for decade upon decade, but they're using their power of their office to actually undermine democracy. So, for example, the idea that the intelligence agencies can use a statute intended to get information on foreigners, on spies, and use it against a presidential candidate like they did on Donald Trump, that kind of stuff is an incredible abuse of power and should stop. When this came out and Trump got wind of it, we actually met in the White House, and I advocated for changing the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court to only apply to foreigners, not to apply to Americans. Right. I was opposed in this by Bob Barr and others, and worked hard to try to get it passed. And this is something I'm still working on, and that is that these intelligence warrants that don't meet the constitutional standard that are used on foreign spies should not be used on Americans. If you want to spy on an American, you should have to go to a regular federal court in Americans, Article 3 court and get permission the way you do traditionally. You shouldn't be able to do it in secret, where there are no lawyers for either side representative. And this is a great abuse of power, and it continues to this day. Yeah, when they politicize DOJ, you have to change the way it works, because we've seen what they've done with it as it is. Dr. Fauci, always bring it up when you have you on. He was on CNN. He was asked about your effort to subpoena his records and get him to testify regarding what happened with COVID-19 and the money that they sent to that lab. Here was Fauci's message to you.
All I have ever done, and go back and look at everything I've ever done, was to recommend common sense, good, CDC-recommended public health policies that have saved millions of lives. If you want to investigate for me for that, go ahead.
Your response to that?
You know, I think there's been a cover-up from day one on the origins of this virus. He obfuscated, lied, dissembled, avoided the truth when regarding whether or not he was funding the research in Wuhan. He eventually admitted it when we called him dead to rights, and we found the actual grant numbers from NIH that were given to the Wuhan lab. He also said it wasn't gain of function. We're going to have a hearing August 3rd in Washington. This will be the first hearing on gain of function research, and we're going to bring forward scientists who are nonpartisan, career scientists, and we're going to ask them the question, was the research in Wuhan gain of function? And I think that many of these scientists have written this. It absolutely was gain of function. So he's been dishonest on all of these fronts. And then when the first information came in on the sequencing of the virus, most of his advisors looked at the sequence, the RNA sequence of the virus, and said, oh, my goodness, this looks like it's been manipulated in the lab. They knew on day one Their suspicions were high. Within days, though, a cover-up formed, and I believe Fauci led this. We will subpoena all those records, and all of these people will testify under oath, not for some sort of show or not for some sort of partisan hearing. This will be done in a very formal fashion by lawyers and scientific advisors, and it will be made public, but it will be done in private so we can get to the truth, and then it will all be made public.
Coming up in August, we, of course, will follow that. Senator Paul, thank you so much for the time.
Thank you.
Tonight, Trump's prediction literally coming to fruition 4 years later. Russia is really putting the squeeze on European countries who are paying the price for their dependence on Moscow's energy. Newsmax correspondent Alex Salvi live in Rome tonight with an update. Alex.
Rob, the Russian state-owned energy giant Gazprom announcing today that it would be reducing its gas flows to Europe to 20% of its total capacity. Now, the company claiming it's the result of maintenance issues, which can't be fixed due to Western sanctions, a claim that's being rejected by EU member states. Energy ministers from the 27 countries agreeing on a plan today to try and curb the threats posed by Moscow by reducing their gas consumption by 15% going through the winter. Now, it's a direct response to fears that Russia could abruptly cut off exports to the continent, sending several nations into a recession and resulting in surging gas prices for hundreds of millions of people. Now, the cuts are voluntary as of right now, with some carve-outs provided for individual nations. But the agreement gives the EU power to make those binding in the event of an emergency. Rob?
All right, Alex Salvi, thank you so much. We appreciate it. All right, we're going to turn now and talk a little bit about this economy. A new study finding inflation is hitting rural America much harder than people living in major cities. According to a report from Iowa State University, rural households are now using 91% of their income just to survive. Think about that. Their earnings are not able to keep up with inflation either. In fact, income in rural areas fell far more than those in urban areas. Study found rural discretionary incomes dropping by 40% this year, in urban areas 14%. And joining us now to talk more about this is chief economist and global strategist of Europac.com, Peter Schiff. Sir, thank you for coming back on the show. We do appreciate it. The last time that we spoke, you painted a very ugly picture about what's coming for the American economy. Has that changed at all in the last couple months?
No. In fact, if anything, the picture is getting uglier.
Yeah, what are you seeing now? What's coming down the pike?
Well, I think we're now in recession, which was something that I had been predicting. So inflation got stronger as the economy got weaker. Yeah. And I think this recession is just getting started. It's going to last a long time. But when you're talking about families that are struggling with inflation, they're really struggling with government, because inflation is a tax. It's the way government finances deficit spending. Government spends money. It doesn't collect enough taxes, so it has to run deficits. The Federal Reserve monetizes those deficits, prints money. They call it quantitative easing, but that's inflation. Yeah. And government is getting bigger and bigger, and families across America are going to have to bear that burden through higher prices.
And we've had, I mean, if you look, it's been so interesting for me to look back through the last 40 years and even longer. And you see this stretch where interest rates were just incredibly low for, I think, about the last 10 years. And you look at that in comparison to the 90s, especially the 80s and even the 2000s, you didn't have that. And we're about to pay a really, really big price for all of that very, very cheap money we've had since Obama.
Yes, because the interest rate should reflect the free market, not price fixing by the government. Yeah. And by artificially suppressing interest rates, the Federal Reserve really screwed up this economy. A lot of things were done that never should have been done. A lot of mistakes were made, malinvestments, misallocation of resources, and now we're going to have to pay a heavy price to unwind all those mistakes. That's why this recession is going to be so severe. That's why this financial crisis is going to be worse than the one that we had in 2008. And anything the government does or the Fed does to try to prevent that just makes it worse.
You know, people right now are freaking out about interest rates. You know, I've got a friend who's got a business, and his rates on his business loan are going up right now. It's not locked in. But if you go back into the early 80s, the last time we had inflation like this, these were the rates that it took to get Carter's inflation under control. And we're seeing a lot of comparisons right now between Biden's inflation and Carter's inflation. Those rates are, and this is nowhere near, what we're seeing right now is nowhere near what it took back in the 1980s. How bad do you think this is going to get? I mean, they're talking about raising the rate, you know, this week up to 2.25% as the Fed funds rate, right?
Yeah, that's still much too low. That's an inflationary, highly stimulative rate when you have the rate so far below inflation. But remember, inflation under Carter didn't start with Carter. It was building for a long time. And the same thing with the inflation under Biden. But it's getting a lot worse now with Biden policies. And the Federal Reserve is continuing the failed policies since the Greenspan era began. But the other important distinction is when you go back and look at those inflation numbers from the Carter days, we had a very different CPI. If we were still using the 1970 CPI today, our inflation would be closer to 20% a year than 9% a year. So it's actually worse than what we were experiencing back then, yet interest rates are still so much lower. So that lets you know just how much bigger this inflation problem is going to get. Plus, the budget deficits we have today dwarf the ones we had back then. So the amount of money that the Federal Reserve is going to be creating in this decade is so much more than was created in the 70s. So this is going to be much worse stagflation. I've been calling it an inflationary depression. That's what we're entering.
And it'll last years, you think, real quick?
Well, it's just going to get worse. Yeah, I think the whole decade. I don't know what it's going to take for the government to finally do the right thing. But the only way to solve the inflation problem is to dramatically cut government spending and to allow interest rates to rise to a market level. Now, when that happens, you know, it's going to be terrible as far as asset prices collapsing, failures, bankruptcies. But we're going to have to endure that to get to the other side. If we want a real economy, then we're going to have to experience a real recession to get there.
Will the government even allow that to happen is the other question. Peter Schiff, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We do appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right, coming up tonight, Trump returning to Washington today, the first time since the end of his presidency. He gave the keynote speech at a summit hosted by the America First Policy Institute. It's a long speech, slamming Democrats for so much incompetence in all the ways that we're seeing right now. Take a listen.
Our country has been brought to its knees, literally brought to its knees, and who would have thought this could happen? The American dream is being torn to shreds, and we will not have a country left if this economic, social, and attack on civilization itself is not quickly reversed.
Let's bring in former National Press Secretary for the Trump campaign, Hogan Gidley. Hogan, good to see you tonight. Two speeches on the same day, Pence versus Trump. What did you make of all that?
Well, look, I think whether Donald Trump decides to be a candidate or a kingmaker, the America First policies are undefeated. The press wants to focus on who he endorsed or who he didn't endorse, or his first trip back to Washington, D.C. No question, it was very important for the future of this country. Only to hear a former president talk about the policies that really improve the lives of all Americans, regardless of race, religion, color, or creed. And what was so fascinating to me is when you compare the kind of whiplash effect of where we were just 2 years ago versus where we are right now, a lot of Americans are sitting up and saying, wait a minute, we want those America First policies back that really gave us a brighter future. Right now, we can't pay for gas, we can't pay for groceries, and all these things Joe Biden pretends as though are happening to him. They're happening because of him, and I think Donald Trump did a really good job of highlighting that tonight.
Yeah, no, he did. And just, you know, as we watch ideologues punish Americans so that they can get to some kind of virtuous future that they think exists if they just keep doing this nonsense. It's so painful, and he delineated that very well today. It was actually a very good speech, and it was a very long speech, too. There was one hilarious moment. I like to laugh. This cracked me up when he was talking about transgender women in women's sports. Enjoy.
A mother and father are screaming, "You got it! You got it, darling. I'm so proud of my girl." Well, she couldn't do it. This guy comes along. He's named Alice. And he looks at the weight. World record.
He was in rare form there for a minute. I got a kick out of that.
He was, and the crowd loved it. I spoke with him before the speech, after the speech, and of course I was in the crowd listening because I love to get a gauge from the audience and see how they react. They loved it because Donald Trump is telling the truth. With the left pushing this woke ideology and refusing to to adhere to definitions in science, and whether they're talking about what a recession actually is or what a woman actually is, the American people know a whole lot better because it's just reality. And when you watch Donald Trump tell these stories, and he also did one about the swimmer Leah Thomas as well, and how the woman that had been trying to break this record by 0.8 of a second, Leah Thomas went right by her 38 seconds and gave her windburn. He was going so fast. This is the type of messaging that's just funny. And it kind of just throws a little shade on all the people on the left, the radical ideology. It's not real. And Donald Trump did a great job of kind of deviating from that script, as he likes to do, and talking directly to the American people without that teleprompter. But you hit on something I have to say. That speech was long. Can you imagine Joe Biden giving more than a 10-minute speech on a teleprompter? Donald Trump goes on forever and connects with the American people, something Joe Biden hasn't been able to do in over half a century in office.
Biden's cooked. And what I loved about it, I mean, the way he talks about it is that, I mean, he's got Republicans when he gives a speech like that. He's got, or at least that part of it for sure. He's got independents. He's got probably most Democrats, too. The only people he's leaving out on an island are the idiots that buy into this narrative that we're seeing, which is really just the administration and all these clowns that live and operate in universities. So, I mean, that's why it was great moments like that. That's when you steal people, is when they act this ridiculous. And he stole some people today. Hogan, thank you so much for the time. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Rob. Appreciate it.
All right, the feds are launching a probe into Tesla. Pretty convenient, right? In a recent court filing by the electric car company owned by Elon Musk, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, accusing Tesla of systemic racism. Okay. Sarah Williamson joins me with more on that. I suspect this is somewhat political, perhaps. What do you see?
Perhaps. There has been several court cases that have been filed against Tesla, majority of them coming out of California. And there is hundreds of complaints in the latest one from African-American Tesla employees who were submitted a case to California's Department of Fair Employment and Housing, who claim that they have been segregated to, quote, the lowest levels of workforce, and lacked representation in ranks of executives, senior officials and managers. Now, Tesla will begin mandatory pre-filing conciliation process with the Equal Opportunity Commission to come to resolution with those who filed these complaints. Yet Tesla is fighting back against these claims, calling them an attempt to generate publicity, and says that the investigations are misguided. And in a blog post, Tesla said it therefore strains credibility for the agencies to then now allege, after 3 years of investigations, that systemic racial discrimination and harassment somehow existed at Tesla. Attacking a company like Tesla that has done so much good for California should not be the overriding aim of a state agency with prosecutorial authority. Now, earlier in this month, Rob, a separate 15-person claim of racism against Tesla and its employees was filed as well. And another claim from a shareholder was filed as well over what they call a toxic work environment. One man was offered $15 million from Tesla to settle the claim, and he turned it down, saying it wasn't enough.
$15 million. You know, I suspect Tesla is not one of these companies that operates like most companies and corporations in this country. They don't hire based on race. I suspect they hire based on merit. And these days, in this environment, I think that will get you some lawsuits. We'll see what happens with this. All right, welcome back. In politics, you hear a lot of lies in order to push an agenda, and on guns, of course, it's no different. Take a look at this tweet from Eric Swalwell earlier today. Last week, we passed an assault weapons ban in the House Judiciary Committee. This week, we'll vote to pass it in the full House. We know these bans work. The last ban, 94 to 2004, saw a significant reduction in mass shootings. Oh, so did it? Well, from the Wall Street Journal, a 2004 report from the Justice Department found that the ban's effects on gun violence are likely to be small at best and perhaps too small for reliable measurement. And that year, Congress let the ban lapse without much debate at all. Interesting information from our own Department of Justice. Joining me now is founder of Black Guns Matter, Maj Toure. Maj, good to have you back on the show. What's your reaction to that? I mean, they say that these assault weapons bans, they work so well. They push this thing really hard in the wake of all these shootings. How do you see it?
They're liars. I mean, flat out. There's, you know, there's a book called How to Lie with Data and Statistics, and it seems like a lot of these guys utilize that book as their Bible. And I don't think that they're actually unaware. I think that they're deliberately being manipulative. You know, you have guys like Biden and other guys in Congress saying, you know, things like, oh, it'll not blow your lungs out. Put a 1-inch hole in the back of your head. These guys are absolute liars, and they're banking on the American people, not because we're so trustworthy. We're supposed to be able to respect and rely on our public servants. They're relying on our ignorance in that regard. He's an absolute liar. Absolute liar.
Give us your philosophy on guns, because I mean, obviously, everybody right now, well, not today, but in the last couple of months, has been talking a lot about it because we saw a big spike in mass shootings. Obviously, we know gun violence. No community is more impacted than Black Americans by gun violence in this country. What's your philosophy?
As you see over the last few years, with our work at Black Guns Matter, you've had a ton of people in those demographics buying guns at rapid paces. Black Americans are the largest new gun buying demographic for about 3 years in a row now, largely in part, you know, small pat on the back.
Buying legal guns.
Buying legal firearms and getting the training that goes along with it. The next phase is going to get people politically active to identify the so-called public servants that are in essence now trying to make these people felons, like with the stroke of a pen. And I think that that concept, you know, gun control was started to make sure that Black Americans did not have the means to defend themselves. Gun control is, you know, the left says all of these, everything's racist. Gun control actually is. It actually is. And so these politicians that say these things, I pose a question to them. Do you think, you know, maybe your security detail or even law enforcement should be subject to the same things that you want the American people to be subjected to? And then you'll get a real clear answer then. Because, okay, if you're a personal security detail and law enforcement, the answer becomes clear. Well, we can't do that because bad guys are out there. Yeah, that's the same reason why I carry a firearm. And so they're aware. They're trying to play on the general public's ignorance and lack of understanding of constitutional and human rights, which are absolute, and just trying to take that trust that we have for our elected officials a little too far.
And what's the answer? I mean, obviously, we see there's a tremendous amount of inner city violence in this country, usually with guns. How do we solve that?
We do that by the work that we've done at Black Guns Matter, givesendgo.com/solutionary. completely crowd-funded work that when we did our concentrated in New York before we started traveling, Philadelphia in 2016, that year, had the lowest violent crime it had since 1979. We leave, we start doing classes all around the country, crime rate, violent crime goes up, including 2021, when we had the most violent homicides in Philadelphia, where we did no classes. So the answer here is education and a respect for the Second Amendment in the demographic that's targeted the most. The irony is, as we get more safe and responsible firearms owners, violent crime decreases. So that's the actual answer, and we have the data to prove it.
I love that. Here's former President Trump on guns. He spoke just earlier today. Take a look.
Take the guns away from the criminals who shouldn't be having guns. Let the people that have to have guns, that need to have guns, let them have them. But take them away from the criminals.
You're nodding your head, agreeing. Democrats would say that's the stupidest thing they've ever heard.
Democrats are generally saying some of the most stupid things we've ever heard, generally. The reality is when there's, this isn't complicated. If I'm the bad guy and I want to go rape women or men, whatever these guys' new persuasion is, if they want to go do that and they know there's a 70% chance that that person is armed and trained, they're going to think twice about it. I think we have to start making sure that the American people understand and support public servants that understand the Constitution and the Bill of Rights is the supreme law of the land, and all of these other unconstitutional statutes are null and void.
It makes sense. I mean, you look at a city like New York, we're all sitting ducks. Nobody can legally have a gun here. And now they've made it like that. But there's illegal guns everywhere.
And they're saying now, after the Supreme Court has made this decision, now they're saying you got to hand in 4 years of your social media presence to get your constitutional rights protected.
Maj Touré, thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Good to see you. All right, yesterday I spoke to Charlie Kirk about Trump's speech from over the weekend at Turning Point USA, the Student Action Summit in Tampa, Florida. An event that was riddled with violent protests outside. Also talked about his new book, The College Scam. Take a look. All right, Charlie, good to have you here on the set. Good to see you in person. You guys had a big weekend in Tampa. You had the president speaking. Let's go ahead and take just a second of that.
Great.
A third world country would never allow what's happening to us right now to happen. Even a third world country. Millions and millions of people are pouring into our country from jails. They're releasing their prison population into the United States of America. We're like a dumping ground, and you're paying the price, and you will in the future.
He makes some points.
Hard to disagree.
Yeah, right? I mean, talk a little bit more about the speech.
Yeah, so it was an incredible weekend. We had 5,000 students from all across the country attend to Tampa, Florida. We had the biggest speakers in the entire movement. That portion was sponsored by Turning Point Action, our political sister arm. And then we held a straw poll. And I wasn't really sure what to expect.
Yeah.
And we had DeSantis the first night and Trump the second night. Trump spoke for almost 2 hours. And the results came out on Sunday. 78% of our attendees voted for Donald Trump as their choice in 2024. 78%. It's extraordinary. And some of the media, I think, is misframing this by saying, oh, it's a defeat for DeSantis. Well, the next question is, if Trump does not run, then who? 83% said DeSantis. So that shows it's just run away. Trump, DeSantis are the two leaders of the Republican Party.
Do you think DeSantis stands back in 24? Do you think he doesn't?
No idea.
No clue, huh?
When I asked him rather directly, it was all about Florida. Governor's race, Florida, 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 and that's exactly what he should be focused on.
That's what they always do, yeah. And you guys had a bit of a protest outside. We got some video of it here. You had people outside with what? So this Nazi flags, swastikas? What was it?
I mean, I doubt the authenticity of this, I'll be honest, meaning they were all masked. There was a bunch of liberal protests that suddenly disappeared and they come up. Obviously, we denounced it wholeheartedly, and we did so vocally, went out to them and tried to confront them. They wanted nothing to do with it. And what was interesting is the liberal media, they're very quick to try to dox people like libs of TikTok. Taylor Lorenz did on from the Washington Post. Yet they were kind of not interested in trying to dox these Nazis outside of our event. I'm not really sure why. Maybe finding their identities might not confirm it. I don't know. It's sort of suspicious. And so, but they were wearing full masks as if they were part of Antifa. Reprehensible if they believe it. More reprehensible, dare I say, if you would go and try to play a caricature of something as disgusting as that.
But liberals would never lie to push their agenda.
No, I mean, it's not like they did that right before the Youngkin race in Virginia when they all tried to dress up as KKK tiki torch members.
Right. Yeah, they would never do such a thing. Got the book right here, The College Scam, Charlie Kirk. New York Times best-selling author. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so people can find it at collegescam.com. So this has been a decade of thinking for me, and I've been kind of living this entire journey, if you will, of what is the purpose of college and what is a scam. And over the last couple of years, I decided to write this book. It took me a long time to research it. There's over 35 pages of footnotes where I say bluntly and plainly that college in America has become a cartel. And for most students, it is indeed a scam. From the financial aspect, from the indoctrination, from the wokeism, from the foreign infiltration. What we have seen in higher education is a non-stop barrage against America's young people. I believe it is the third rail. I believe not only is it overrated, but it's harmful for so many young people that enter into college. And I think we as conservatives need to be very clear about that.